We are delighted to be able to welcome you all here today to talk about this book on the anniversary of the release of this book on grading goal 4. This event is one of the ways in which NORRAG fulfills its mission to produce, disseminate, and broker critical knowledge on topical issues that emerge in education and development. So through these programs, the knowledge production that we do and dissemination, like today for this book and the updated presentations that we will hear today, NORRAG contributes to enhancing the conditions for participatory and evidence-informed policy decisions in order to contribute to improving equity, access, and quality of education. And apart from welcoming you all to this event, I have very little more to do except to introduce you now to Antonia, who edited this book on grading goal 4, and she will take over proceedings from her. And great thanks to Antonia from Education International for being here today. Antonia.
Thanks so much, Moira, and a warm welcome from my side as well to you all. Great to see so many of you with us today. So Grading Goal 4 is a book that came from the recognition that SDG 4 has an absolutely transformative potential. So it could play a transformative role. It came from a recognition that the breadth of the goal was in itself an important recognition of the right to education spanning across a continuum. So from birth, early childhood, through to higher education, adult education, lifelong learning, and that important recognition of how interconnected both the problems and the solutions are. So we're dealing with the social and the environmental, as well as the economic challenges and development. It also came from the recognition that the goal itself has a few structural weaknesses, mainly the lack of accountability and the lack of financing, which means that already when being adopted, it was at a risk of failing. So the book is really an invitation to the education community to engage with SDG 4 as a global development framework, to criticize it, to scrutinize it, the power dynamics behind it, around it, and to basically come together and build the capacity that we need to be able to make sure that it is implemented as well as monitored, and that it is implemented in a rights-based way, of course. So before we're kicking off today, I'm going to say a few words about these structural weaknesses. And I'm also going to share some of the outcomes of the first part of this webinar that we had on Monday. And now on the screen in front of you, I hope you can see the exciting table of contents. As you can see, we are covering a lot, and biased as I am still warmly recommending reading all of the chapters. So the SDGs, when they were adopted in 2015, were adopted in a political context, which meant that an ambitious agenda almost necessitated a lack of accountability and a lack of any financing agreements. Meaning that had there been accountability, had there been committed financing, we would probably have had a much, much less ambitious agenda. And I think that's an important structural shortcoming and starting point to recognize as we now grumble about the limited implementation of the goal. So it basically leaves us with a situation where implementation is voluntary, it's supposedly country-led, So there are no implementation modalities. There are no financing commitments. And there is, in fact, a rather bizarre framing of all actors being equally necessary and all sources of financing being equally welcome. So rather than framing the state as the duty bearer and as the kind of the one who committed to the SDGs in the first place, the agenda in itself is really saying that all implementation is equally good implementation. And this, of course, makes the agenda vulnerable from the very start, because it does mean that you can kind of pick and choose. You can choose which part of the agenda that you invest in as a government. You can choose which target within SDG 4 that you as an international organization put money and resources behind, and so on and so on. So we are really looking at what's fundamentally a renegotiation of the role of the state as the one that traditionally has been providing education, funding education, and assuring the quality of education. That was before COVID hit. Then came COVID. And what we have seen is that COVID-19 has really deepened and exacerbated the problems, the structures of inequality that already shaped education systems in most of the world, if not all of the world. So we've seen in the past year and a half how already marginalized groups have been further marginalized, how some of the progress made in recent years has actually been undone. So we're looking at an increase in child labor for the first time in years, for instance. And the same goes for gender equality, it goes for the inclusion of indigenous peoples, so on and so on. And of course, important to also recognize the pandemic has come with a financial impact as well. So we are now looking at the situation where most countries are struggling with fiscal deficits, high debt levels, and a situation where, frankly, a majority of the countries in the world are expecting to be making budget cuts. So that will, whether we want it or not, it will have an impact on education systems and our ability to realize SDG 4. So the webinar on Monday was really looking at how the scope of SDG 4 and its breadth, importantly, has been questioned, challenged, and redefined in the first years that have passed since its adoption. And we of course looked at what's happened in light of COVID as well. And I just thought that I would say a few words, rudely shortening the presentations made by the panelists. But we had Will Smith of chapter 11 discuss global learning metrics and how the onset of the pandemic has in fact furthered a development that we saw in the first years after the adoption of SDG 4, where you have a kind of utilitarian and economistic approach to education and to kind of learning in particular, and a development where the so-called global testing culture has really been strengthened. And I think Will did a very, very good job showing how some of the metrics that have been created to monitor the implementation of SDG 4 specifically is undermining the whole ambition of a broad education goal and a broad education. So an education system that really provides for all of the values, attitudes, competencies that we need. And that's a conversation that we're continuing tomorrow. Then Elaine Unterhalter of chapter 6 was looking at higher education and the extent to which higher education can become more equitable. She was asking the crucial question of whether higher education, whether we are concerned with the quality for those who have access to higher education, or whether we are looking at ensuring quality beyond and really looking at the role of higher education institutions in societies more broadly. And she was calling for a new understanding of higher education, where we're not looking at richness in terms of money, but really richness in terms of understanding and in terms of connections. And then Stephanie Bengtsson and Bilal Barakat looked from chapter 10. They challenged the notion of teachers having become more central thanks to the dedicated teacher target that we have within SDG 4. They were discussing how the target itself is quite reductive in its way of framing teachers as supply. And we're really challenging the extent to which teachers have got any attention at all in the years that have passed. They also highlighted the indicators as an area that really illustrates how little progress we've made on some of the targets. And I think that was one of the big conclusions on Monday, that the indicators or the metrics that we use to somehow frame and thereby understand progress is really shaping our understanding of SDG 4, and it is hugely reducing the scope of SDG 4 and thereby also its transformative potential. So that's a pretty perfect starting point for our conversation here today. We are going to have 3 of the chapters represented. What we are hoping is that all of you who are joining us, that you listen carefully and critically, and that you share the questions that you have in the chat, so that we can have at least one question after each of the presentations, and then we hope to have some time for discussion at the very end as well. So today we're looking at sustainability, and we're looking at sustainability in terms of what is taught in school today, how is that taught, but also sustainability in the broader sense of education and how it's structured, how it functions. I think COVID has raised a lot of questions around the sustainability of our education systems and the extent to which they are equipped, resilient enough to deal with crises, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's democratic crisis, so on and so on. And we are going to kick off with Iveta Silova from chapter 14. That's a chapter that she co-authored with Hikaru Komatsu and Jeremy Rapley. And Iveta is really going to challenge the link between education and sustainability, questioning, if I can say, whether more and better education is what we need at all. So Iveta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Antonia, for the great introduction and for continuing this very important conversation. It's becoming only more and more urgent. So let me quickly see if I can share my screen, and then I will begin the presentation. As Antonia mentioned, so this is a chapter that I co-authored together with Hikaru Komatsu from Taiwan National University and Jeremy Rapley from Kyoto University. And we have been working on these ideas for now quite a few years, trying to understand the role of education as one of the mechanisms towards or key instruments towards sustainability and survivability. And in this process, we started kind of questioning the very assumptions underlying the visions of educations that we think would move us towards sustainability. So I will discuss that today. And partially, it comes from this assumptions that we all make, including politicians and policymakers, about education playing a very central role in solving the climate crisis. And it's inscribed all over SDGs, right? And the ratification of the SDGs in 2015 coincided with the also historical UN climate change conference that was held in Paris, the COP21. And at that time, the global community set this very ambitious goal to try to keep the global warming below the 2 degrees Celsius threshold, and failure to do so, the Paris Agreement warrant, would lead to catastrophic consequences, right? And we hear the warnings continuing and escalating on a daily basis, basically, right? From, the world scientists argue, in alarm, telling us that we are in crisis, right? And that we have to immediately act now, that we have the last chance to really redefine the future of the planet. To Pope Francis, right, who spoke at the COP21, and very similarly, right, in a similar way and vein as a scientist, basically argues that every year the problems are getting worse. We are at the limits. And in fact, he said, and this is how we start the paper, that we are at the limits of suicide right now, right? Collective suicide. And just yesterday, the Guardian had this article published about leaking report of the latest IPCC that will be presented at the COP26 this fall. And the report, basically, this leaked report draft basically says that our prospects are much, much worse than expected, right? And that some predictions are that already by 2026, in just a couple of years, right, we may cross this threshold of 1.5 degree Celsius, which will lead to cascading ecological catastrophes, and including the almost 99% death of the coral reefs, and and so much more, including species, and of course huge impact on humans as well, right, in terms of the climate migration and displacement and more. And yet, in all of this, so there is obviously a huge climate emergencies that we are facing. We also are positioning education as one of the key instruments to solving the climate crisis, right? And the assumptions that we are making here is that that education, more and better education, would lead to better sustainability outcomes, right? And it's inscribed in SDG 4 itself, but it's also mentioned in several other SDGs, right, as a very critical mechanism. And so we are trying to, in this paper, question some of these underlying assumptions, and we draw on the existing literature and the colleagues who have been actually questioning these underlying assumptions for years. So we are trying to bring some empirical evidence also to support this questioning of underlying assumptions. And so one of them is that the SDG 4 emphasizes education in terms of potential economic social benefits rather than environmental consequences, which may be problematic. So basically it places economic sustainability and social benefits above the environmental consequences. The overall logic of SDGs is that the goals depend on each other, but no one has really specified exactly how. And when interactions between different SDGs are considered, they are imagined as exclusively positive, that is reflecting the assumptions that improving existing forms of education will positively impact environmental sustainability, right? And so these are some of these assumptions that we are trying to question in this paper. And in particular, especially keeping in mind the fact that today the world is the most literate it has ever been. We have the most people in school, probably with the highest scores, achievements, student achievement scores than ever in the history. And yet we are closest to the environmental collapse, right? So we are asking this question, is more of the same type of education will really help us in this crisis, right? And in fact, trying to make an argument that education in its current form is in fact implicated in the environmental crisis that we face. And we are making the connection that it is also a cultural crisis, because the educations that we are right now promoting as a solution to SDGs is the one that prioritizes human exceptionalism, that prioritizes neoliberal individualism, and that really promotes infinite economic growth. And more of the same type of education will obviously not help us. And as David Orr said in 2011 already, more of the same kind of education will only compound our problems. It's like we are digging ourselves in a deeper crisis. And so we are exploring this relationship between improvement of education access and quality on the one hand, and a climate crisis on the other hand. And arguing that knowledge and skills alone would not be sufficient to achieve environmental sustainability. And instead, we suggest that culture, which encodes our attitudes and values, strongly affects human impacts on climate. And we are proposing different ways of conceptualizing culture here, using the ideas from the cultural psychology and looking at the independent versus interdependent selfhood as something that reflects our cultures. So, for example, just very briefly, I'll say we define culture not as a stable set of beliefs or values stored in people, but rather as something materialized in the patterns of practices and institutions. So, for example, an individual born in a society develops oneself through practices in a given society, and in this process self-reproduces and reshapes practices and institutions within that society. So that means that culture and self interact with each other in a system of this, what we call the cultural cycle. And also there are degrees of diversity and difference and a lot of overlap. The dominant forms of self-control generally differ from one culture to another. And in particular, the independent self-control is dominant in individualistic countries such as UK or US or Australia, whereas interdependent self-control depends on the dominant in societies with strong non-Western societies usually, right? And these different ways of conceptualizing self and culture have important implications for understanding how societies function and how they respond to different crises, right? And in particular, studies in cultural and environmental psychology suggest that the interdependent self tends to be more concerned about the others and more effective in controlling one's own desire and behavior for the sake of collective social benefit. And in contrast, independent self is based on the assumption that individual is prior to the society, right? And so it promotes the autonomy and individual self-interest. And so in some of our empirical analyses that we are trying to do to explore these ideas, so we show that countries with strong individualism tend to not accept anthropogenic cause of climate change and tend to have greater impact, environmental impacts on Earth. And so we also link that to education as well. And later on, we try to also play with some of these ideas and in the context of COVID, right? And also to show how the way different cultures reacted to COVID actually also reflects very similar ideas about selfhood, right? So in, for example, countries with moderate or strong individualism, including the US, the COVID deaths were much higher than in the countries that had much weaker individualism, right? In the countries that were more interdependent. And so that's really interesting. So in fact, this coronavirus pandemic has demonstrated the tragedy of dismissing this interconnectedness, cultural interconnectedness in favor of global competitiveness, economic growth, and overconfidence in neoliberal individualism. So just to recap very quickly, countries that insisted on prioritizing individual freedom suffered tragically high infection rates and death tolls from the coronavirus pandemic, right? The US and the UK in particular. And individuals in these countries often downplayed and sometimes downright rejected basic public health measures, such as wearing face masks, like here in Arizona, for example, where I am. And in the US, the mask itself became highly politicized symbol of individual rights. And by contrast, the epidemic was managed much more effectively in countries that prioritized collective action over individual freedoms and not delaying economic shutdowns or mobility restrictions or social distancing mandates, like in Taiwan or Vietnam or South Korea or China. So in these countries, citizens seem to have acted with fuller awareness of others, responding to the pandemic in more collective and interdependent ways. And I'll just very quickly run through the conclusions here. So we are asking challenging policymakers and practitioners to be very cautious about the effectiveness of ESD as currently proposed, right? The education for sustainable development that really is rooted in the idea of human-centeredness and human exceptionalism, such as, for example, the ideas of child-centered learning as one of the examples, or the prioritization of economic growth over environmental sustainability. We also challenge ourselves and the other scholars and practitioners to be more aware of the deep assumptions underlying different education practices and policies, and also really calling our education community to rethink the relevance of the universal scales of sustainability that we are using right now. So we explore some of these ideas more in other papers as well, including in the blog that we wrote for the NORRAG blog, where we explore COVID-19, climate and culture from this lens in more detail. The papers that we just published in Comparative Ed Review, where we look at student-centered learning and environmental sustainability and what that means, what the links are there, and exploring some of the alternatives in the UNESCO's Futures of Education report, Learning to Become with the World, where we look for some of the existing practices that really focus on more interdependent cultures and the role that education plays in re-articulating culture in those ways. So I will stop here and look forward for some of the discussion with the colleagues.
Thanks so much, Yvette. And this was a great last slide, a reading list for the summer for those who are still looking for things to read. So this is a fascinating picture because we are also hearing about a learning crisis where somehow education is framed as just one big failure. And as you, Yvette, pointed out, actually, I mean, we have more children attending school and learning than we've probably ever had before. And there's a question in the chat about the root causes for the failure of policymakers, governments to really take this agenda seriously. And the comment in the chat is referring to the UNESCO recommendation from 1974, so taking us way back, way before the SDGs were adopted. So any thoughts on these, the root causes for our failure here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so no, very, very good questions. And well, I think some of the root causes is really, maybe our failure to really think what education is for, right? The really underlying us, and I think it actually goes to maybe I'll just step back to the first point I made, the interdependence of different SDG goals, right? So we think that all of them right now are equally contributing to sustainability, but there is more and more questioning of this and challenging the idea that perhaps the pursuit of economic growth is not compatible with some of the environmental goals, right? And including the, the balance of the biodiversity or, other SDGs that we have. So, but education, if we look at it really closely, policymaking is really still really directly and closely linked to the idea of economic growth and the idea that the whole logic of modern education, and at least, is really rooted in the idea of the infinite economic growth. And so, I think if this underlying assumption does not change, I think it's very difficult for us to kind of reimagine how education can act differently to support sustainability, right? Because in a way, what we are doing right now is really producing more manpower that is designed to enter the labor force to really work towards a goal of economic growth, right? Which is in itself incompatible with environmental sustainability. And so it's this rebalancing and rearticulating education towards other goals that I think is really important, but it's also very difficult. And I also understand it's a very contentious idea, right? When we talk about the budget cuts in the education sector, and where one of the main arguments that is used on, at the global level in particular, is that, well, the more you invest in education, the more the higher GDP growth you will have, right? But I think we really need to step back to think about what that means and whether it's really compatible with the larger goals.
That's great. Thanks, Iveta, because that's also a perfect bridge to our next panelist. Joel Westheimer has written chapter 13, and it's a chapter that looks at citizenship education. So really looking at the extent to which education systems are succeeding, and very, very easy to make parallels to Iveta's thoughts there on the usefulness, the kind of education systems fostering useful people for the economy rather than citizens. What Joel is arguing in his chapter is that all education systems are teaching lessons in citizenship, whether they recognize it explicitly in the curriculum or not. And this just works perfectly, I think, as the next presentation. So Joel, please, the floor is yours, and do keep the questions coming in the chat. We'll take at least one directly after Joel's presentation.
Thank you, Antonia. It's wonderful to be here. It's nice to see all the people from all over the world, which is the advantage of the Zoom thing, of course, but none of us are really sure what here in any meaningful sense of the word means. I mean, I'm here, you're here, but really none of us know who's wearing pants. I'm sure some of you, when you teach, wonder these things. I used to wonder whether my students had done the readings. Now I wonder whether they've done the readings, whether students can hear my dog barking, and I wonder which of my students have pants on. And this would normally be an extremely inappropriate question, but only during the pandemic could these questions come to mind. I normally live in Ottawa, Canada, but I am currently in New York City because I'm visiting my 93-year-old mother and trying to ease the conditions of the pandemic. But it's great to be here to talk to you about this. You know, the pandemic has exposed so many truths about our society that many of us here on this panel and all of you have discussed for years, but are now very much in our face in a way that we can't deny. It served like an X-ray to expose these truths and put them front and center in a way that we haven't seen before. And I'm going to talk about my chapter very briefly, but I'm going to talk about it in the context of what we've learned from the pandemic related to education and sustainability goals. And the first, I'm going to talk about three lessons that we learned just for brevity. And the first one, I think, is very consistent with the way that the SDGs have been framed, and in particular SDG 4, in a good way, in a positive way. And that is that the pandemic has served as an X-ray that's exposed the massive inequality and the ways that inequality undermines the work that educators do. This shouldn't need to be a new lesson, but it was a wake-up calls, right? These are the fault lines that have become so visible over the course of the pandemic. Poverty and economic inequality, unequal access to quality education, unequal access to high-speed internet in this case, and computers, and inadequate resources for those most in need. These are the things that are very well addressed by the Sustainable Development Goals, because many of the goals, not just Goal 4, but in particular Goal 4, are addressed to alleviating these inequalities, to addressing these inequalities in education and making sure that children around the world have access to quality education. The degree to which that the goals can be successful in that regard, as Iveta noted and Antonia noted, has of course to do with the acceptance or challenges of global capitalism and the ways that inequality is reinforced. But the fundamental message behind it, which is that children need access to quality education, was very much highlighted during this past year and a half during the pandemic, because even within nation states, within any given country, we saw the massive inequalities that play out across children's home. We are literally transported into children's homes, right? We see some kids with their own desk, with their own computer in a quiet room doing their education, and we see other children sharing a table with siblings and maybe sharing a computer with their parents and so forth. And I feel like this served as a kind of metaphor or a proxy for the broader inequality that we've saw. And so that was revelation number one from this pandemic. And I think that the SDGs are oriented in a way that they at least were making that part of the conversation. But I want to talk about the remaining two revelations from the pandemic that I think the SDGs, and in particular SDG 4, is less good at addressing, and yet is essential if we're going to make a difference in sustainability in the long term. And the first of those is that I think a lesson that we learned is that content in curriculum matters much more than coverage. For decades, the school curriculum has become increasingly consumed with all the things students should know before they graduate. And that has resulted in an unprecedented global obsession with micromanaging teachers' work to ensure that the right information is taught at any given time, and with standardized testing to find out if they're succeeding. Every day over the last year and a half, we read about children falling behind. But the curriculum is bursting at the seams, right? So we have to ask ourselves, falling behind what? Falling behind who? This was a global pandemic, and the benchmarks we set for knowledge goals and for content goals are essentially arbitrary, right? Have people reached a grade 3 or 3rd grade level at a particular moment in time, those are arbitrary benchmarks. And if I ask all of you attending today to tell me about the ancient civilization of Mesopotamia, I'm guessing that some of you may be able to stretch back into your memory of 5th grade social studies and tell me all about it. And some of you will say, where was Mesopotamia again? My point being that, or I could ask all of you for the three functions of the cell, or what the mitochondria does in the cell, right? These are things that we learn and quickly forget unless they become part of our professional endeavors. My point being that covering the curriculum does not matter as much as taking quality samples of knowledge to go in depth, right? One way of thinking about it is that a deep dive into topics of social concern and of importance is much more valuable than a shallow swim across endlessly expanding content throughout the curriculum. And yet education worldwide has not caught up with this basic fundamental fact about 21st century life, which is that we don't need endless lists of facts in our head, because we all carry these things around wherever we go, and we can find out any fact that we need in a few seconds. What we need is the processes and the qualities of how to learn, how to put facts together to tell a coherent narrative, and how to be excited and enthusiastic about the things we learn and apply them to the world outside of school. 21st century living, to live a good life in the 21st century, does not require endless knowledge of every possible topic in the curriculum. It requires in-depth knowledge of a few areas of importance to students and teachers in local places, so that they understand the process of education as we know it. And yet very little has changed in that regard worldwide for education, and very little and the SDG 4 does very little to challenge that concept of education, coverage over content, okay? So that was my second lesson, is that content matters much more than coverage. The last one, which I'll just talk for a minute about, is the lesson that we learned, I think, is that teaching is essential work. And any of you who are parents know that we learned this lesson all too well. I remember the wonderfully amusing memes that appeared all over at the beginning of the pandemic. I'm sure some of you saw it. Like a few that I heard were, homeschooling day 1. And just like that, teachers were appreciated again. Or homeschooling day 3, we should double our teachers' salaries, right? And my favorite one that I saw was something like this: homeschooling day 7, I must apologize to the teacher for insisting that Susie was gifted, right? So we've all became very familiar with the difficult and challenging work that teachers do every day in the classroom. And although SDG 4 does mention briefly teacher professionalism and teacher work, it does little to substantively challenge the increasingly global idea that that teachers' work is either easy or that teachers need to be guided specifically with very detailed accountability measures and testing to find out whether the work that teachers do is happening properly. This is all built on the assumption that teachers' problems, anywhere where there are problems, is that they're not well motivated enough to teach their children. And obviously anyone who's been in a school knows that that is patently ridiculous. And what we need to be focusing on is the important work that teachers do, and recognizing that teachers' working conditions are students' learning conditions, right? So after the pandemic, will it be a little bit harder to claim that teachers are lazy or have too much time off in the summer, or that class size doesn't matter? I think it will be just a little bit harder, and I'm hoping that that the next set of Sustainable Development Goals or any United Nations or UNESCO goals related to education factor into account the idea that teachers' work is essential. Because it is, and that's where we need to be focusing resources. So I want to have a little bit of time for discussions, but I just reviewed 3 essential lessons, one of which is addressed well by the SDGs, and that is the way that the pandemic has exposed inequality in education, massive inequality that we have both within countries and between countries, and the need to address those inequalities in order to have an effective form of education that would allow teachers to teach students about global citizenship and about sustainable development. But the other 2 lessons that we should learn from the pandemic, I'm not sure how much they will be incorporated into the next Sustainable Development Goals, and that were first, that content matters much more than coverage, that we need to give schools the freedom to pursue forms of learning that matter at the local level between teachers and students, and not force this idea of coverage that everything needs to be learned in exactly the same way. When we talk about falling behind right now, we could get rid of this idea that children are behind to such a great degree if we stop thinking that every part of the curriculum needs to be covered. Of course, we're going to need to do some catch up on children's literacy skills, on their numeracy skills, but not every child needs to know the details about ancient Mesopotamia. They need to know the details about some ancient civilizations so that they know how this work happens. And finally, that the lesson that teaching is essential work, and that we have to provide the conditions for teachers to do their jobs and do a much better job of respecting the professionalism that teachers have if we want to see them able to pursue sustainable development goals in any meaningful way. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joel. So there's been a lot of interesting questions in the chat. And I think what we've heard, at least within Education International, is that many teachers have felt that online teaching and learning has made it much more difficult to address all of the non-cognitive dimensions and content within the curriculum. And I was wondering, Joel, if you could reflect a bit on these kind of learning goals as arbitrary benchmarks, and what that then means for that non-cognitive side. We also have a question here about international assessments as a form of modern day colonialism. Knowing that there's a decade left of SDG 4, what's the way forward? Kind of trying to make a bit of progress towards target 4.7, which is still a powerful framework for things that we do want students to learn.
Absolutely, and I thanks, Antonia. I want to be clear that, of course, the SDG 4 does have a lot of the goals that we care about. I mean, here's one little piece of it. It says, acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development, sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, and so forth. So that rhetoric is there. But as Iveta pointed out, the ways that these goals create tensions with goals of global capitalism and the idea of a constantly expanding economy filter their way into education as well, right? Part of the project of coverage, the idea that what students need to know is a lot of information in a very shallow way, is part of the capitalist project, right? It's a means of accountability, because we know that we can easily measure whether students know that the Norman invasion was in 1066, right? They either know that or they don't. It's much harder to assess whether students have developed notions of critical thinking or are able to work collectively with others to challenge laws that threaten the very sustainability of our planet, or policies or behaviors, right? These are things that are more difficult to measure, but the global educational project of accountability and standardized assessment is obsessed with information and coverage over deeper notions of critical thinking and content. And that's what I think has to change if we're going to take many of SDG 4's goals seriously as we move into the next 10 years.
Thanks, Joel. Lots to think about, and I'm going to move us forward to the last presentation so that there is time at the end for discussion. But do keep using the chat. So we're going to move to chapter 9, which is written by Kate Moriarty and Yusuf Syed. I think Kate is the one who's going to start. And Kate and Yusuf are really discussing the notion of quality within SDG 4. It's often framed as a goal for quality education, has often been understood as representing an important shift. What Kate and Yusuf do is challenge that notion and reflect on some of the tensions and challenges that characterize this notion of quality. So Kate, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Antonia. And in fact, both Yusuf and I are going to present. I'm going to start off and then hand over to Yusuf. And I'm just going to share my screen. So I hope this works. And let me see. Did that work? Yeah. So just to say, yeah, first of all, thank you to NORRAG for hosting these webinars, to Moira and to all the colleagues there, and thanks to you, Antonia, and I think, I think Hugh McLean is on the call and others that were kind of instrumental in getting this idea off the ground, and obviously to all the kind of authors and fellow panelists, and here we are, the last presenters, but I think a lot of what we're going to say maybe complements and reflects back with some of the other conversations. So, thinking about a year on, we started with that to think about, what was the context when grading goal 4 was published, and then what's happened a year on. So, looking back, there were 200 and with a decade left to the 2030 deadline of the 2030 agenda. There were, 258 million children out of school. 127 million of those were living in countries affected by crisis. There was a consistent lack of funding for education in both development and humanitarian contexts. The private sector was held up as kind of privileged as a possible solution. As we've heard, there was like global teacher shortage, and as Joel was just talking about, and others have said both today and on Monday, the issue of equity and inclusion, levels of poverty, discrimination, these were all barriers to education. And crisis was also, although I would argue that it was not fully articulated within the SDG 4 text itself, although maybe in the framework for action, and I know there's others maybe who are participants here today that would have a slightly different view, but it wasn't adequately reflected in SDG 4, and as COVID has shown, neither was the preparedness factored into education systems and education planning. So a year on, we're still living through a global pandemic. We've got a growing number of people in need of humanitarian assistance. We've got the highest number of forcibly displaced people ever. There's cuts to domestic spending, and we've seen widespread school closures, and in many countries schools are still closed. I think they're opening, they're closing, and as other people have said, this has put increased pressure on teachers, it's intensified inequalities, and it's also, and I think this kind of relates back to some of the presentations on Monday, it's creating some of these new discourses around learning loss and new ways of doing education. And just a couple of points, although I'm not actually speaking with my INE hat on, although I do work for INE, but both Yusuf and I felt that it was really important to like highlight how the pandemic, how it's kind of generalized the experience of education exclusion and marginalization that is always experienced by those that are living through crisis and conflict or in very low, income countries or low, in communities of high levels of violence. And, we've now been talking about a global education emergencies, but the part of the risk of that as well is that this diverts away from existing crises. So I think we were thinking, what in terms of what were the opportunities last year, what we felt, maybe we thought this decade, 10 years left, it would be difficult, but now we're thinking, is there a build back better? But that remains to be seen. So, oops, I cannot seem to move my slides on for some reason. Oh, it's the have. So just really quickly, just to say, and obviously this has already been said by others, but the 2030 agenda is a really, ambitious development framework. And if you took it at face value, it's a really radical political project, right, that is designed to transform the world. And education is identified as, as key to that as a standalone goal. And I think I wanted to bring that point up because I know, back in before we had SDG 4, or the SDGs, we worried that if education would even be there, but it is there, and it is an ambitious framework. I won't talk, I think Antonia, you've covered this a bit, but there were these two processes, and in a way this brings out some of the tensions that you see around quality of the open working group, and then also the UNESCO-led kind of more technical process, the Incheon Declaration, etc. But there was a common agenda to shift the focus from access to access plus, but what wasn't was a kind of bone of contention throughout the policy formulation process was whether that would be around quality education or whether it would be around learning. And this was a big issue. In the end, we see, possibly a compromise where in the goal you have, equity, so you have quality and learning both mentioned. So Yusuf and my analysis was that, the SDG, that there is this thing called a quality turn, is how we phrased it in the chapter. The SDG 4 does make this clear and obvious commitment to quality, is part of the goal, it's embedded in targets, and also it appears to embrace this more expansive notion of quality that includes the affective dimension. And that's in target 4.7, which Joel has just read out, so I'm not going to read it out again. But, and it also relates to what Iveta was just speaking about as well. So, it's around human rights, education, global citizenship, and education for sustainable development. And, why is this affective dimension important? Because, as we've heard and as we can see, this SDG 4 is, even before the pandemic, was being developed in a context of increasing physical and symbolic violence, of xenophobia, of racism, of a denial of rights, of environmental crisis, and also rights denied for refugees, for migrants. So it was really important to have that dimension. But our analysis was that although this, we welcome this and we see this as important, and it is something, as you just said, Antonia, it's there, it's good, it can be developed, but at the same time, our analysis was that it's only a partial shift towards this effective, and this target 4.7 is really poorly articulated in the sense that multiple areas are all lumped together, and what this means is it is at risk of becoming a residual target that's too broad and too complicated for governments to implement. And I think, Antonia, you made in your introduction today, you were saying that all of the SDGs and SDG 4, you get to pick and choose, right? There isn't a shared. And so given that this is a complicated target with so much in it, it becomes easy for it to be marginalized and sidelined. And then that is kind of reinforced by what we see as a hierarchy of learning in the way that the targets 4.1 and 4.7 are articulated. So, you have target 4.1 that's described as relevant and effective learning. These are really kind of words that resonate, and then 4.7 is to promote. Well, that could be positive as well, but I think sometimes then the way that these are read or described really does make a difference to create some kind of hierarchy that even you could argue, and I think someone said this on Monday, I think teachers came last of the 10 targets, and then 4.7 is the last of what you might call the kind of, the general targets are not the means of implementation. So was there, even in the order that things were created, did that imply a kind of hierarchy? And so, we say, our analysis is that, that these tensions over quality, although there is, an apparent broadening, that the tensions aren't resolved between whether it's a rights-based approach or a human capital model of quality. And ultimately, this human capital model, this economic model, is much stronger in the articulation of SDG 4. And that becomes even more so when, after the formation of the actual text, you have the creation of the global indicator framework. And through the global indicator framework, more emphasis is put on 4.1 and only certain aspects of 4.1. For example, 4.1, the actual target, it talks about free education, it talks about completion, but what's being measured, as has already been said, is kind of an arbitrary level of maths and literacy at, ends of certain grades. So, and measurement drives action, and the cognitive is prioritized. So just to sum up, and before I hand over to Yusuf to talk about the implications of COVID, so what we really concluded was that there's really conceptual limitations within SDG 4, and that the concept of quality is narrowed and reduced in kind of instrumental ways that make it less, reduce its potential reach and its impact. And teachers are reduced to instrumental means of an implementation strategy. There's no mention of pedagogy. There's a narrow curriculum focus. As I've just said, there's this, from the goal to the targets to the indicators, you get the notion of quality is gradually reduced and narrowed, which ends up delegitimizing this effective dimension, this quality turn into a kind of instrumental economic view of quality. So while the SDGs hold this promise of, that's there in 4.7, ultimately it's a very narrow view. And I'm going to hand over now to Yusuf to then link that back to kind of, what that means in terms of quality. So Yusuf, over to you.
Thanks. I'm aware that we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just make 4 points, because I think what Kate and the other speakers today and the day before spoke about the conceptual, policy, practical, and implementation gaps and challenges of the SDG 4 as a goal, as a set of targets, and as a framework of indicators are revealed in the understandings of COVID-19. And the 4 points we want to make when we think of education quality and learning in relation to COVID, the first point is an obvious one. A lot of the discourse of COVID-19 and education is framed in terms of learning crisis, learning loss, content being lost. In other words, it conceived in very similar way and in very similar narrow ways as target 4.1 is conceived in the goals. In a sense, it privileges to an extent the literacy and numeracy learning in education term, and arbitrarily so, affecting what one would call affective learning or social and emotional learning, yet the pandemic reveals that to be the most important. So in paradoxical terms, it's 4.7 that's perhaps more important than 4.1, yet the responses have been centered around 4.1, because there's been talks about curriculum coverage, ambitious government plans for recovering the curriculum, and in many senses, the narrow focus on content and curriculum belies the fact that teaching and learning is a process in schools. And the school is more than a vessel for content. It's also a social space. It offers children more than academic learning. It's a space of protection, nutrition, social interaction, friendship. What we know, some of our other papers call the sociality of pedagogy, drawing on other work. That teaching and learning is about the sociality of pedagogy, which gets underestimated and ignored in discourses. Yet there are some positive and perhaps green shoots and innovative approaches which need to be encouraged. We note a shift, albeit not widespread, in some contexts from high stakes examination, and openness of adjusting to what is valuable in the curriculum. Governments have suddenly decided and teachers are on cutting back curriculum. For example, in South Africa, in the research we did, government has said we can cut back some of the curriculum because it's arbitrary what gets constituted as a syllabus for grade 7, 9, 10, 11. And it's quite easy to then afford teachers the opportunity to rethink and overload curriculum. But those aren't the dominant discourse, but they are in the discourse and they need to be thing. The second thing, which I think a lot of the discourse doesn't speak about, is how EdTech has emerged as a solution, and a problematic solution as that. Distance learning the problem is not just about the inequities of data and access, it's the fact that large corporations determine the content, the framework, the modalities in which it's offered. And it's that which we need to talk about. EdTech is possibly a solution, but the one set of groups of corporations that did not see their profits struggle in the process were the EdTech giants, Zoom being one of them in particular. And the question is, who puts the content, who owns the content of the materials out on platforms and Zoom? And we then raise the question fundamentally about there's a difference between simply placing material on an online platform and automating what you do anyway, and rethinking the pedagogy of online learning and distance education. We can move to the next slide. So that was the second point. Kate, we can move to the next slide. The third slide was our third point. Our third point is about teachers. I think just picking up a few points, what everybody says. Clearly, the one group of actors we argue who's been very marginal in discourses around this have been teachers, despite increased demands placed on them. And more importantly, teacher professional development for their work during the pandemic has been ignored. Just a survey we did of 8 countries in Africa and interviews said that none of them felt that they were receiving enough support or enough of the right kind of support. And more importantly, their well-being and psychosocial support was lacking to being non-existent in most contexts. In other words, the working conditions of teachers in the pandemic, if it was bad before, got worse to an extent. And the pandemic revealed the lack of attention to teachers as active agents whose working conditions need attention in as much as learners in the system. In terms of the system, we talk about the lack of preparedness of a system, which is a bit of a surprise because in a sense, if you're thinking about resilient systems and responsive systems, you would have thought that systems would have been much better prepared for such pandemics. Even though we couldn't predict the pandemic, there have been crises around. And in that sense, we also talk about how science was constructed during the pandemic in education terms. And we talk about the over-reliance on a particular kind of natural science, which in itself is not consistent nor reliable, nor have a simple solution in the absence of social science. But we also talked about the absence of a science of the knowledge of teachers and knowledge of educators and education professionals. For example, we give an example in one of our paper where it's the Pediatric Association which says that schools must open or close. And their argument is simply based on whether children transmit the virus or not. But beyond that, there are other kinds of dynamics in organizing learning spaces in poorer communities that are beyond the science of that kind of science. We often talk about how the system tends to ignore the needs of impoverished learners. By cutting school feeding, it cut a major supply for impoverished learners to access. It cut cultural capital. Not every family comes with the same level. Homeschooling makes sense if your parents and your guardians and your access can support it. But if you come from a marginalized area with low levels of literacy, for example, not that literacy is the only thing, but the ability to support or the lack of space, then clearly there's a problem. And we also talk about how systems tended to not get right the balance between national and local and global versus national needs. In particular, we think, and in our reflection, we talk about, you need a national response to the crisis, but you need local responses to specific dynamics about delivery of education. And it's that balance between the two that we need. So when we were then thinking about what we think about building back better, we're thinking about developing responsive and resilient quality education system. I won't go through all of this, but few things. One, we think that you need to build resilience into initial teacher education and continuing professional development. It's surprising that teachers say they weren't prepared for this when you thought the professional development system would cater for that. We think that you need to build back a more expensive notion of education, quality, and learning. The affective and the social is as important, or the non-cognitive is as important as the cognitive, if not more important. We think you need to rethink education dogmas, opportunities to challenge accepted approaches, including high-stakes exams. There's nothing about high-stakes exams in and of themselves that makes sense, other than what we use to select and screen people, right? We can find other ways, and countries have explored that. We need to be concerned about the dangers of privatization. EdTech, for example, homeschooling, which fragments the education system. The right-wing groups in the US are arguing that the pandemic has been an advantage because it's brought the small world of homeschooling into the public discourse and made the private world of the alt-right the home of the public education system. In other words, we need to build and protect the public education system in the future for cohesion and for other purposes. We need to build responsiveness and flexibility into the curriculum and learning. Crises are not exceptional events, though the pandemic may not have been forced. We think that you need meaningful policy involvement. And we also taken aback by the fact that, one of the things the pandemic reveals, the last point I want to make, is that it's revealed the connection of the SDGs between the global north and the south. And that's been the one advantage of this development framework, right? Because it's highlighted that both the global north and south are both affected and should be affected by this. And in that sense, one of the writers point out that, the global north had a lot to learn from the global south during this pandemic. The global south countries, as many, have been dealing with crises. And surprisingly that the global north countries like the US and UK were seen to be so underprepared and unprepared for the crisis, when they could have learned a lot more from the global south. We also think you need to consider about accelerating action on SDG 4, because the pandemic will not only set it back, but we're already about 9 years left to the 2030 target, or so we need to think about it, how we achieve it in the time, particularly when it's setbacks. Because, for example, one of the easier to reach targets of the SDGs, which is eliminate and eradicate extreme poverty, has just increased. Extreme people living in extreme poverty has increased substantially in the last year. So one target which was projected to be achieved has been set back. And so I think we need to rethink and talk, have an open conversation. And that can only be done if you have meaningful policy involvement and policy choice making amongst all those involved. Thanks, I'll pause there, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Kate and Yusuf. I'm not very good at this kind of cheering and cutting people off, because I get very excited about all the things that you're saying. But I am afraid that we're not going to take a question for Kate and Yusuf, because we are running out of time. There was a question in the chat about the impact on girls, and that's the perfect bridge for inviting our discussant to share a few thoughts. Anjum Halai is one of the authors of chapter 3 in the book that deals with gender equality, education and development. Anjum, please, about 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and good day, colleagues. Very interesting, thought-provoking presentations. I participated in the session on Monday as well, and there are many common strands. But today, the focus has been on sustainability by education and sustainability in education. And I would say the two are interconnected, but also slightly different. So when we talk about sustainability by education, it's very clear, and it has come out in several ways, that we have to challenge the assumptions that underpin the education provision, the entire education endeavor. And more of the same is not going to work. So education, from its historical focus on economic and social returns, very much in the realm of growth of economy, that is resulted in a very reductionist focus on literacy and numeracy. And those of us who live in low-income countries and have given our lives to education in low-income countries often saw massive projects which were termed as education reform, but were actually only focused on improving technically the literacy and numeracy skills. So that needs to be challenged if we are aiming for sustainability by education. And that challenge needs to look at education in a holistic way, including the economic, social, and the environmental dimensions, and not take a reductionist focus on the academic content and skills. But when so that strand comes out very strongly, and it was mentioned that the rights-based approach to education is one approach to challenge the reductionist assumptions underpinning education. But the rights-based approach also focuses very much on the human-centeredness, and it could potentially include the rights of the nature and the rights of the non-human, to take a more holistic approach of sustainability by education. So that's a strand that I think is a strand that emerged, but we could have spoken a little bit more about that and unpacked what it would look like when we include in education the rights of nature and rights of the non-human in relation to the traditional human-centeredness notion of rights. Then we come into sustainability in education, and sustainability in education begs the question, who are the key stakeholders at the heart of the education endeavor? And I would say the teachers and the students. And we find that although teachers play a very important role in ensuring that education continues in all its multiple manifestations, teachers do not have the voice, they do not have the power, and the pandemic exposed that quite brutally, if I may use that word. So, for example, when it came to assessments, teachers who are very closely involved with the learning and know their students very well, the teacher-led assessments were doubted, they were put aside, and instead what was favored were large-scale tests under some kind of notions of objectivity and reliability. So that kind of the messaging, the belief that and lack of trust about teachers not being equipped to do the very work which they have been doing and which they do very well, that belief needs to be challenged and that belief needs to be questioned. In relation to teachers, the point was made that teachers' working conditions are students' learning conditions. And the pandemic exposed that when you look at the notion of well-being, of mental health, the holistic well-being of the teachers was never at the or I would say very little at the forefront, what was at the forefront was, how do you take care of the access to the curriculum, but through digital and other technological sources. So that then again, the issue comes out that sustainability by education and sustainability in education then become intertwined, that if it is the notion of education is not challenged, if we don't look at the holistic notion of education, then obviously our responses in the pandemic reflected the very reductionist view. And we looked at access to curriculum, access to literacy, numeracy, or those features that were traditionally valued. So I feel that, and then the third point in looking at the discussions, very much what counts as the takeaway from the education for the learners, for the students. It's not the content knowledge, but it is what is it that the learners and the students will do with that knowledge. The difference lies in the pedagogic process. And the pedagogic process is something that needs to be highlighted in how education will contribute through how sustainability will be built in the education process, because the traditional notion of knowledge banking has to be challenged. And I think a good feature that emerged from the pandemic was how when in some contexts the curriculum was reduced, teachers and education systems were forced to think what matters, what is core and what is peripheral, and what should go forward. And in that, at least the pulling back and questioning happened about the core content and what could be the pedagogic process. So to conclude, the discussions over the 2 days highlighted many of the features of the SDG 4. We highlighted in fundamental ways what needs to be challenged in SDG 4, and we also, in my view, we pointed out some of the directions for future, so that education can be a part of the solution of the sustainability and does not exacerbate the problem. And I think I thank the presenters for some very good, thought-provoking presentations that led to these deliberations. Thank you very much. I think I'm at the end of my 5 minutes. I would have spent a lot of time if I had gone into gender inequity issues, which are the focus of my chapter.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anjum. And that's the thing. A lot of time could be spent on so many of these different dimensions. I thought I would invite the panelists for a kind of 45-second challenge, just trying to make the most out of the time that we have left, and wanting to give you the chance to share any final reflection, anything that struck you and you'd like to share with the participants. Iveta, putting you on the spot.
Thank you so much. There is not much I can say in 45 seconds, but just wanted to thank everybody for all the really thoughtful comments in the chat box, and just I hope that we can continue this very urgent conversation moving forward, because obviously we have so much rethinking to do and kind of reimagining of education to do. And I just wanted to maybe very briefly comment on some of the conversations in the chat about also redefining what we do in education and how we think about interdependence, not only in human terms, but definitely also ultimately in more than human terms, and how we are interdependent with nature, and how that could be, again, re-articulated in education and also in, the broader culture as we move forward. I mean, I think it's obvious right now that, SDGs will not be met. They will have to be by 2030. Also all of the, climate change targets that we are setting for 2030 will not be met either. I think it's all, very clear at this stage. So I think it's a really urgent moment right now to begin rethinking and kind of radically redefining the future goals that we will be setting for ourselves, so we have a chance to survive and also give a chance to other species and other beings to survive, in the decades to come.
Great.
So thanks for joining this important conversation that we must continue.
Thank you. And Joel?
I just want to say that I think it's wonderful reading the comments in the chat. So thank you for all those thoughtful comments. I want to say, and on an optimistic note, which is that the pandemic has created an unprecedented opportunity for shifting our ways of thinking about this. And of course, as panelists noted, the tech companies are going to are coming in and trying to make sure that that shift means a shift to everything bad. And but we also have an opportunity. It's an opportunity, I think, that a window that is open right now to rethink the goals of education, to rethink our obsession with assessment and testing and standardization, and to make room for things that matter. And that's an opportunity I don't think we should squander. And I think that window is going to last for maybe a year or so. And it's a great moment to be pushing this kind of work. Thanks for organizing it.
Great, thanks, Joel. Kate?
I'll just take 30 seconds since we took too long in our presentation, but I think, in terms of what Iveta just said, will the 2030 deadline be met? Probably not, but let's not give up, and let's keep the pressure on for it to be met, right? And really keep pushing on this, as Joel said, maybe taking advantage of where we are, of what's happened in the last year, to really keep to push this, a different vision of education. And I think, there's a new UNESCO paper on the futures of education. I know that's, I think I asked the question when there was a presentation on that, how will that be implemented? I think it's not meant to be implemented. I think we also have to say, yeah, we do need to implement, new ways of understanding education. And you mentioned, Antonia, right at the beginning, that, this is about the right to education. And we've had the right to education for more than 70 years. And the right to education also includes quality and a holistic vision of quality. And we do need to keep pushing on that. So with that, I'll hand over to Yusuf.
Great, Yusuf.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I want to pick, thanks. I think the panel's been great and the comments been useful. I'm going to pick on two very quick comments by Jordan. One, I think he's right. The challenge of the SDG is not only what it says, but who gets to define it, who gets to implement it, and who gets to fund it. And that's going to be critical in terms of how it evolves. And secondly, I think he's right to point out the cautions about building back better as a quick hand slogan for the new one. But perhaps the reality building on this panel is not build back better, but build back differently from what we used to do before. And that is the positive note I'd like to end on.
Great, thanks, Yusuf. I also saw Jordan's comments and was going to make a comment about the role of international organizations as a kind of group of actors that haven't really been looked at maybe sufficiently, recognizing, of course, that not all international organizations are the same. Some are heavily underfunded. Some, you could argue, are almost overfunded, given what they are trying to do. And the way that international organizations have been crucial in cherry picking and redefining the scope of the SDG 4 efforts. So really wanting to end by pointing out that SDG 4 was in many ways the result of heavy fighting by civil society, trade unions. When it was adopted, we declared victory, just in the sense of being so excited about what the goal included, what that breadth could represent. And I think what we need to remember now is that governments are the duty bearers, but all of us, each of us, teachers, students, but all of us have a legitimate role to play in holding governments to account, remembering that the governments have a say also on the international organizations, and to really assess the extent to which governments are delivering on their obligations as the duty bearers of the right to education, as well as those who signed up to the SDGs. Ending with a huge thank you to NORRAG for making this webinar possible, both on Monday and today. And then recognizing that Hugh McLean of the Open Society Foundations was included as the other half of the closing remarks. So Hugh, it's 34, so I guess it's about 30 seconds left for you.
Oh, that's fine for me. Just wanted to say thank you very much. There's nothing more for me to say. It's been a fantastic session. Really, really wonderful inputs. Just thank you so much for organizing and for all of the attention and care. I think it does open us up the question about what do we do? What actions do we take forward? And I think there were a lot of ideas about that. How do we build the partnerships to do that? I think really is the thing we need to focus on now. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks to everyone. Take good care. Keep those questions coming. Don't hesitate to send them over to me or any of the other panelists. I'm happily volunteering them all to continue the conversation and keeping up the good work. Take care.
Thank you all very much. Bye.
Thank you.